On October 7, 1944, American bomber crews, climbing into their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators for another daylight raid over Germany, had no idea they were about to face a weapon that would redefine aerial warfare. They had been briefed on the usual threats: swarms of conventional German fighters, deadly flak batteries, the risk of mechanical failure over enemy territory, and the constant possibility of being shot down and either killed or captured. What they had not been adequately prepared for, what their intelligence officers could not fully convey, because the threat was so new and so revolutionary, was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. That day, Me-262s would attack American bomber formations with devastating effect, destroying approximately 25 bombers before American P-51 Mustang escorts could intervene effectively. The massacre demonstrated in the most brutal terms possible that jet propulsion represented a quantum leap in aerial combat capability, that German engineers had created a weapon generations ahead of anything the Allies possessed, and that if Germany had deployed this technology earlier and in greater numbers, the outcome of the air war over Europe might have been dramatically different. This is the story of how the future of aerial warfare arrived on October 7, 1944, how German jet fighters slaughtered American bombers with shocking efficiency, and why, despite this technological superiority, the Me-262 could not save Germany from defeat. To understand the significance of what occurred on October 7, 1944, and why the Me-262 was such a revolutionary and terrifying weapon, we must first comprehend the state of aerial warfare in autumn 1944 and the technological gulf that separated jet aircraft from conventional propeller-driven fighters. By October 1944, the air war over Germany had reached a crescendo of intensity and destruction. The United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force had been conducting sustained strategic bombing campaigns against Germany for over 2 years, attempting to destroy German industrial capacity, disrupt transportation networks, break civilian morale, and force Germany to divert resources to air defense that could otherwise be used on the fighting fronts. The bombing campaign was extraordinarily costly for both sides. Allied bombers faced sophisticated German air defenses that included thousands of anti-aircraft guns, extensive radar networks, and a fighter force that, while numerically declining, remained capable and dangerous. The American approach to strategic bombing centered on daylight precision attacks against specific industrial and military targets. This required bomber formations to fly deep into German territory in broad daylight, making them vulnerable to both fighters and flak. To protect the bombers, the Americans had developed long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, which could accompany bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and engage defending fighters. By autumn 1944, this combination of heavy bombers and long-range escorts had achieved air superiority over Germany. German fighter losses had become unsustainable. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced, and fuel shortages were limiting training and operations. The Luftwaffe was losing the air war, and both sides knew it. However, German engineers and scientists had been working on revolutionary technologies that could potentially reverse this situation. Among these technologies was jet propulsion, the use of gas turbine engines instead of conventional piston engines to power aircraft. Jet engines offered several enormous advantages over piston engines. They were mechanically simpler, with far fewer moving parts. They could produce far more thrust for their weight. Most critically, they allowed aircraft to fly faster and higher than any piston engine could achieve. A piston engine fighter like the P-51 Mustang had a maximum speed of approximately 440 miles per hour. The Me-262 had a maximum speed of approximately 540 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster. This speed advantage meant that Me-262 pilots could choose when and where to engage enemy aircraft. They could attack bombers, break off before escorts could intervene, and escape pursuit because no Allied fighter could catch them in level flight. The Me-262 had been under development since 1938, making it one of the longest-running German aircraft development programs of the war. The technical challenges involved in creating a practical jet fighter were immense. Early jet engines were unreliable, had very short operational lifetimes, consumed fuel at prodigious rates, and were difficult to manufacture with the materials available. The airframe had to be redesigned multiple times to accommodate the engines and to handle the higher speeds that jet propulsion allowed. Wind tunnel testing revealed problems with wing design at high speeds. Landing gear had to be strengthened to handle the higher landing speeds. Dozens of technical problems had to be solved, each one requiring time, resources, and expertise. Moreover, the Me-262 program suffered from competing visions of how the aircraft should be used, from bureaucratic infighting within the German military and aviation industry, and most damagingly, from Adolf Hitler's personal interference. Hitler, upon seeing the Me-262, became convinced it should be developed as a high-speed bomber rather than as a fighter. He believed that what Germany needed was a fast bomber that could strike at Allied invasion forces, not another fighter to defend German cities. This decision, made over the objections of fighter pilots and many Luftwaffe commanders who understood that Germany desperately needed superior fighters to counter the Allied bombing campaign, delayed the Me-262's operational deployment by months. Development effort was diverted to modified aircraft to carry bombs, testing bomb racks and release mechanisms, and training pilots in ground attack tactics rather than air-to-air combat. Only in late 1944, when the military situation had become truly desperate, was the Me-262 finally authorized for large-scale deployment as a fighter. By the time Me-262s began appearing in significant numbers in autumn 1944, Germany's strategic situation was catastrophic. Allied forces had liberated France and were advancing toward Germany's borders. Soviet forces were driving into Eastern Europe. German cities were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Industrial production was declining, despite frantic efforts to disperse factories and move production underground. Fuel shortages were becoming critical, limiting training for pilots and operations for all military branches. The Luftwaffe had lost thousands of experienced pilots, and replacement pilots were being rushed through abbreviated training programs that left them inadequately prepared for combat. Into this desperate situation came the Me-262, a weapon that was technologically a generation ahead of anything the Allies possessed, but that arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war. The pilots selected to fly the Me-262 were among the most experienced in the Luftwaffe. The aircraft was difficult to fly, particularly during takeoff and landing when the jet engines were most vulnerable and when the aircraft was at its slowest and most exposed to attack. The engines had a tendency to flame out if throttle was advanced too quickly. They took time to spool up to full power, meaning pilots could not make rapid throttle adjustments. The landing speed was much higher than conventional fighters, and the brakes were inadequate, meaning landing required long runways and careful technique. Pilots had to learn entirely new tactics, because the Me-262 flew so much faster than any aircraft they had previously flown. Traditional dogfighting techniques that relied on maneuverability were less effective when you were flying 100 miles per hour faster than your opponent. Instead, Me-262 pilots had to learn to use speed to make slashing attacks and then escape before enemy fighters could respond. The armament of the Me-262 was devastating. The standard fighter variant carried 430mm Mk-108 cannons in the nose, giving it tremendous hitting power. The 30mm round was far more destructive than the machine guns and 20mm cannons carried by most Allied fighters. A few hits from the Mk-108 could destroy a bomber, tearing off wings, detonating fuel tanks, or shattering fuselages. The high rate of fire meant that even a brief firing pass could place dozens of rounds into a target. However, the 30mm cannon had limitations. It had a relatively low muzzle velocity, meaning the rounds took time to reach the target and dropped significantly over distance. This made long-range shooting difficult and required pilots to get relatively close, typically within 600 meters, to ensure hits. At the high closing speeds of jet combat, pilots had only seconds to line up, fire, and break away. By October 7, 1944, Me-262s had been flying combat missions for several weeks, and their effectiveness was becoming clear. They had shot down numerous Allied aircraft, both bombers and fighters, with a loss rate far lower than conventional German fighters. Allied bomber crews had begun to report encounters with these mysterious, very fast aircraft that appeared suddenly, attacked, and disappeared before escorts could respond. Allied intelligence had identified the Me-262 and understood its capabilities, but knowing about the threat and being able to counter it effectively were two different things. Allied fighters simply could not catch Me-262s in level flight. The only effective counter was to catch them during the vulnerable moments of takeoff and landing, or to outnumber them so heavily that some escorts could position themselves to intercept while others protected the bombers. On October 7, 1944, the target for American bombers was likely industrial facilities deep in Germany, possibly in the Ruhr region, or in central Germany. The exact target is less important than the operational pattern. Hundreds of American bombers, flying in tight defensive formations, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs and other fighters, penetrating deep into German airspace to strike at targets the Germans desperately needed to defend. The bomber formations were massive, sometimes stretching for miles across the sky, boxes of aircraft flying in carefully choreographed positions, designed to maximize defensive firepower and to ensure that if one aircraft was damaged or shot down, the formation could continue. Each bomber carried 10 men whose lives depended on the formation holding together, on the escorts keeping German fighters away, and on the flak being inaccurate enough that they could reach the target, drop their bombs, and make it home. The German defenders knew the bombers were coming. Radar stations tracked the formations as they approached. Fighter units were alerted and scrambled to intercept. Among these defenders were Me-262 units, elite formations equipped with the jets and tasked with attacking the bombers. The Me-262 pilots climbed to altitude, positioned themselves ahead of the bomber stream, and prepared to attack. Their tactics were straightforward: build up speed in a diving approach, close to firing range as quickly as possible, fire a brief, concentrated burst, and then use their superior speed to escape before the escorts could react. The goal was to hit as many bombers as possible in a single pass, to create maximum disruption in the formations, and to escape with minimal risk. As the Me-262s rolled into their attacks, diving toward the bomber formations at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, the American gunners saw them coming and opened fire. The defensive armament of a B-17 Flying Fortress consisted of 13.50 caliber machine guns, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. A formation of dozens of bombers could put up a wall of fire that was dangerous to any attacking fighter. However, the Me-262s were so fast that gunners had only seconds to track, aim, and fire. The high closing speed meant that even experienced gunners struggled to get accurate fire on target. The Me-262s flashed through the formations, their 30mm cannons hammering out shells, each hit potentially fatal to a bomber. Engines exploded, wings were shot off, fuselages broke apart, and bombers fell from the sky trailing smoke and flame. The P-51 Mustang escorts saw the attacks happening and tried desperately to intervene. They dove toward the bombers, trying to intercept the Me-262s, but the jets were simply too fast. By the time the Mustangs reached the bombers, the Me-262s had already made their attacks and were accelerating away at speeds the Mustangs could not match. Some Mustang pilots fired at the retreating jets, but the range was too great and the closure rate was negative, meaning the jets were pulling away. A few Me-262s may have been damaged by defensive fire from bombers or by lucky shots from escorts, but most escaped unscathed, their speed providing near immunity from conventional fighters. The massacre lasted only minutes, but in that brief time approximately 25 American bombers were destroyed or so heavily damaged they could not make it back to base. Each bomber lost represented 10 men killed, wounded, or captured. The loss rate for this single mission was catastrophic, far exceeding normal loss rates, even for heavily defended targets. The surviving bomber crews landed back at their bases in England, shaken and demoralized. They had been attacked by something against which they had no effective defense, something that could destroy them before they could even fight back. The speed differential was so great that the standard defensive tactics of flying tight formations and putting up concentrated defensive fire were largely ineffective. The Me-262s simply attacked too fast for gunners to track effectively. American intelligence officers and mission planners were forced to confront the reality that Germany had deployed a weapon that fundamentally changed the calculus of the air war. The Me-262 represented a capability gap that could not be quickly closed, because the Allies had no operational jet fighters. British and American engineers were working on jet projects, but none would be ready for combat deployment before the war ended. This meant that for the remainder of the war, Allied bomber crews would face an enemy that possessed technological superiority in the most critical dimension: speed. However, American planners also understood that the Me-262 had vulnerabilities and limitations that could be exploited. First, the Me-262 was produced in limited numbers. German industry, under sustained Allied bombing and struggling with shortages of materials and skilled labor, could not produce jets in the quantities needed to make a strategic difference. A few dozen or even a few hundred Me-262s could inflict significant losses, but they could not stop the thousands of Allied bombers that were attacking German targets daily. Second, the Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The jet engines took time to spool up to full power, and during this vulnerable period, the aircraft was slow and could be attacked by conventional fighters. Allied fighters began targeting known Me-262 bases, loitering near the airfields and attacking jets as they took off, or as they returned to land with fuel and ammunition exhausted. Third, and most critically, the Me-262 could not change the fundamental strategic situation. Germany was losing the war on all fronts. No amount of technological superiority in one weapon system could compensate for the overwhelming numerical and industrial superiority of the Allies. Germany was being crushed between Soviet forces advancing from the east and American and British forces advancing from the west. German cities were being systematically destroyed. Industrial capacity was collapsing. Transportation networks were being obliterated. The population was demoralized and increasingly convinced that the war was lost. The Me-262 was a remarkable achievement, a weapon ahead of its time, but it arrived too late in too few numbers and could not alter the trajectory of a war that Germany had already lost. The losses on October 7, 1944, while severe, did not force the Americans to halt their bombing campaign. Instead, the Americans adapted their tactics. Escort fighters were instructed to patrol Me-262 bases and to attack jets during their vulnerable moments. The bomber formations were adjusted to make attacks more difficult. Additional escorts were assigned to missions. Intelligence gathering was intensified to identify Me-262 bases and production facilities, which then became priority targets for bombing. The Americans accepted that they would continue to suffer losses to Me-262s, but calculated correctly that Germany could not produce enough jets to make those losses strategically significant. For German pilots flying the Me-262, the experience was bittersweet. They possessed a weapon that was clearly superior to anything the Allies had. They were achieving kill ratios that far exceeded conventional fighters, and they were demonstrating that jet propulsion was the future of aerial combat. Yet they also understood that their individual successes could not change the outcome of the war. They watched as their country was destroyed around them, as fellow pilots were killed in combat or in accidents, as fuel shortages grounded aircraft, and as the strategic situation deteriorated daily. Some Me-262 pilots became aces, shooting down dozens of Allied aircraft. Others were killed or captured. All understood that they were fighting a lost cause, that no matter how many bombers they shot down, more would come, and that Germany's defeat was inevitable. The technical lessons learned from the Me-262 influenced post-war aviation development profoundly. Both the Americans and Soviets captured Me-262s, studied them intensively, and incorporated the lessons learned into their own jet programs. The basic design principles of the Me-262, the swept wing configuration, the pod-mounted engines, the armament layout, influenced the first generation of American and Soviet jet fighters. The tactics developed by Me-262 pilots, the high-speed slashing attacks, the use of superior speed to control engagement and disengagement, became standard jet combat doctrine. The vulnerability during takeoff and landing that Allied fighters exploited against Me-262s led to post-war emphasis on protecting airbases and on developing aircraft with better acceleration and climb rates. The psychological impact of the Me-262 on Allied aircrews who faced it was significant and lasting. These men had trained to fight a certain kind of air war, had developed tactics and procedures based on the capabilities of piston-engine aircraft, and had achieved a degree of confidence born from months or years of successful operations. The appearance of the Me-262 shattered that confidence and forced them to confront the reality that technological advantage could shift rapidly and that enemies could develop weapons against which conventional tactics were ineffective. The bomber crews who survived encounters with Me-262s never forgot the experience of watching these incredibly fast aircraft flash through their formations, destroying bombers with impunity and disappearing before anyone could respond. Many described it as the most frightening experience of their combat service. More terrifying than flak, more unnerving than attacks by conventional fighters, because it demonstrated so clearly their vulnerability. The broader strategic question raised by the Me-262 is what might have happened if Germany had deployed it earlier and in greater numbers. If Hitler had not insisted on developing it as a bomber, if production had been prioritized, if the technical problems had been solved more quickly, could the Me-262 have changed the outcome of the air war over Germany? The historical consensus is that while earlier deployment might have inflicted greater losses on Allied bombers, it could not have prevented Germany's defeat. The fundamental problem was not technological but strategic and industrial. Germany was fighting enemies with far greater resources, far larger populations, and far more industrial capacity. Even if Me-262s had shot down twice as many Allied bombers, the Allies would have simply built more bombers and continued the campaign. The American industrial machine was producing aircraft, engines, and munitions at rates Germany could not match even under ideal conditions, let alone while under sustained bombing and blockade. Moreover, the Me-262 faced practical limitations that would have constrained its effectiveness, even if produced in greater numbers. The jet engines had very short operational lifetimes, typically 10 to 25 hours before requiring complete replacement. This meant that each aircraft required multiple engines over its service life, multiplying the industrial burden. The engines also consumed fuel at high rates, exacerbating Germany's already critical fuel shortages. Training pilots to fly jets required time and fuel, both of which Germany lacked by 1944. The specialized materials and skilled labor needed to produce jet engines were in short supply. The manufacturing facilities were vulnerable to bombing. All these factors meant that even with total commitment to the Me-262 program, Germany could not have produced enough aircraft to decisively impact the strategic balance. The story of October 7, 1944, and the broader story of the Me-262 is ultimately a story about the limits of technological superiority in Stepanix warfare. The Me-262 was a genuinely revolutionary weapon, a technological breakthrough that gave Germany temporary advantage in one dimension of aerial combat. However, technological superiority alone cannot win wars. Wars are decided by combinations of factors including industrial capacity, strategic resources, manpower, leadership, morale, alliance structures, and geographic position. Germany in 1944 was catastrophically disadvantaged in almost all these areas. No single weapon system, no matter how advanced, could compensate for these fundamental disadvantages. The 25 bombers destroyed on October 7, 1944, represented tragedy for the 250 men who were killed, wounded, or captured. For their families, the war would never be over. For the survivors, the psychological scars would last lifetimes. For the Americans conducting the strategic bombing campaign, it was a painful reminder that the enemy was still dangerous, still capable of innovation, and still able to inflict significant losses. For historians examining the event decades later, it stands as a dramatic illustration of how aerial warfare was evolving, how jet propulsion represented the future, and how even desperate nations under extreme pressure could still produce remarkable technological achievements. The Me-262 was the future arriving in the midst of a war Germany had already lost, a glimpse of what air combat would become, and a testament to the skill and determination of German engineers and pilots who created and flew a weapon that was generations ahead of its time but could not save their country from defeat.